But now I want to talk about tonight. It takes an optimist these days to be an ecologist. I think it would surprise many of you that ecologists are both severely depressed and incredibly optimistic all at once, except for tonight's speaker, who's just always optimistic. Peter Groffman was a scientist, or I should say is a scientist at Cary for 28 years, the first 20 of which he was a full-time scientist, and since 2017, did I get that right, 16, 17? Yeah, has been a senior research fellow. Peter has a full-time appointment at the Advanced Science Research Center and the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York City, and is a professor of Earth and Environmental Sciences at Brooklyn College. Usually Peter stands up here and talks about some aspect of nitrogen, because anything worth knowing about nitrogen, Dr. Groffman knows. Anything not worth knowing about nitrogen, Dr. Groffman knows. And he would tell you about the places there's too much nitrogen and why we're worried about that. But increasingly, he would tell you about the places there isn't enough nitrogen and why we're facing a nitrogen deficit. I don't think you're talking about that at all tonight. A little bit, okay. Didn't think he could get away with it. But fundamentally, that's not what's going to be the core of tonight's talk. It's what I would call eco-optimism or earth optimism. It is about why we should be happy and why we should think that science and ecology are going to help us get through the future or get to the future. It's also, I think, a bit of a practice talk for Peter, because he is the 5th Cary affiliated scientist to be elected the president of the Ecological Society of America. And as president, yes. And you're president-elect, then you're president, and then you're president emeritus. So it's a 3-year term, but you only get 1 year as president. But as president, I think it's important, Gene Likens, Bill Schlesinger, Stuart Pickett, and Kathy Weathers before Peter all had the role of being a spokesperson and a booster for ecology. So I think it's a real pleasure to have Peter here tonight, and I am sure you will enjoy his talk, and I'll stop there so we have some time for questions. Dr. Groffman.
So I am delighted to be able to give this talk. In science, we spend a lot of time evaluating. We have internal evaluations, we have external evaluations. We bring people in from the outside. Are we doing good science? Are we doing useful science? Is our science evolving to meet new challenges that arise? And it's an old topic here at the Cary Institute. So in 1997, we had a Cary conference. We brought in scientists from all over the world to talk about successes, limitations, and frontiers in ecology. In 2009, we had another Cary conference on are we effectively communicating our science information so that society could use the information. And so we've been thinking about this a lot. And now, as Josh pointed out, I have this new reason to think about it because I'm going to become the president of the Ecological Society of America. And I'm spending a lot of time thinking about ecology as a science. Have we been successful as a scientific discipline? And so I'm delighted to be here to give this talk, and thank you for coming. So I'm going to make a pretty strong, pointed case that ecology has been very successful as a scientific discipline. And I have a pretty expansive definition of success. So I'm going to say that to be successful, we need to do good science to diagnose problems and propose solutions to those problems. But then we also need to work to have those solutions implemented by society. We then need to track the success of those solutions over the long term. It's a pretty expansive definition of science, and many of us would say, well, all right, I can see this first part, we have to do that kind of science, but are we really responsible for having solutions implemented by society, and are we supposed to track their success over time? I would argue that we do, and I would argue that we have in ecology, and that's a big reason why we've been successful in ecology. So that's my thesis that I'm hoping we can get some discussion going. I'm going to give some examples. I can talk about DDT and the return of the bald eagle, talk about acid rain and eutrophication of lakes, rivers, and estuaries. I'm going to share some ideas about why we've been successful, and then I'm going to talk about some of the challenges coming up, and are we poised to address some of these challenges? Okay, so let's start with DDT and the return of the bald eagle. Who has seen a bald eagle in the last year? Look at that. Look at that. so this is an amazing success, right? When I was a kid, there were no bald eagles, right? I grew up in New Jersey, there wasn't a lot of stuff. But even in the Adirondacks and the Catskills, there weren't bald eagles at the time. And so, and the question was, what, so we know that the bald eagles were killed by DDT. DDT was a powerful and very useful pesticide that was widely used, and it was responsible for the decline of the eagles. And figuring out the science, it was a super complicated piece of science, because DDT is not directly toxic to eagles. It's not like, the eagles die. It's not toxic to humans either. It's hell on insects. But it's not toxic to eagles. And actually, in the middle of the controversy, a chemist, I think from Chevron, went on TV and drank a vial of DDT. He died the next day, but no, he didn't. He didn't. It's not directly toxic. And so DDT kills eagles by thinning the shells of their eggs. And so the eggs have thin shells, and when the eagles sit on the nest, they crush the eggs and the babies die. Now, how did scientists figure this out, right? So in order to figure this out, the way it works is DDT is used in various areas. It washes from those areas into streams, and there it gets on the little bugs, and then the little bugs are eaten by the big bugs. The big bugs are eaten by the little fish are eaten by the big fish, and the big fish are eaten by the eagles. And at every stage in that food chain, DDT is accumulating or bioaccumulating. And so by the time it gets to the eagles have a lot of DDT in their blood. We all actually have DDT and other chemicals in our bodies. But in the eagles, it then causes the eggshells to thin, and then the birds die. Now, how did they figure this out? Right, so in order to figure this out, you needed to know something about birds, you needed to know something about insects, you needed to know something about fish, you needed to know something about hydrology, you needed to know something about microbiology, and you had to understand the connections between the different parts of the landscape. And from an ecological point of view, the real advance was this idea about biomagnification, that the idea that toxins that we release in the environment accumulate as they move up the food chain. And so there were big advances in ecology, thinking about food chains and biomagnification, and then you coupled that with this connectivity, understanding of connectivity, and you had a really clever, integrative scientist. Rachel Carson was able to put all this together. And so there was a great science success story. But Rachel Carson was also quite active at saying, well, they proposed a solution, you're going to have to ban DDT. But then she worked really hard to again, get it implemented. So we identify the problem, we propose a solution, we then have that solution implemented, and then we track the success. And there are now hundreds of thousands of eagles across the country, and it's a wonderful success. Again, define the problem, propose a solution, have the solution implemented, and then track the success. Now, in all the examples I'm going to give you, I'm going to talk about some nice success, but I'm also going to talk about some of the emerging challenges that are in all these areas. And we'll ask the question of, are we poised to address the emerging challenges? So, okay, so the emerging challenge with DDT is malaria. Right, so malaria is a vicious disease in many parts of the world, especially less developed countries. DDT is extremely effective against malaria. So we ban DDT, and it raises environmental justice issues. Do we enjoy seeing eagles while people get to watch their children die of malaria in Africa and other less developed parts of the world? It's an emerging challenge for us. I would argue that we are poised to address this challenge because we have new science, and also we've actually changed the way we do science. And so in particular, I'm very impressed with the ecology of infectious disease, which is a new area of ecology that's emerged, very much centered here at the Cary Institute and other places. But the ecology of infectious disease says, can we understand how these diseases are rooted in ecosystems, and can we use that understanding to reduce human exposure to these diseases? And the ecology of infectious disease is very exciting new science that has emerged to meet this problem. The other big advance has been the emergence of sustainability science and the triple bottom line of ecosystems, environment, and economics. So now when we look at any problem like like DDT, we then have to look at this triple bottom line, and it makes us much more alert or poised to identify problems like environmental justice. So DDT and bald eagles is a great success. There's still challenges that have emerged, but I'm going to argue that we're kind of poised to address that because our science is evolving in useful ways. So that's my DDT case. Let's talk about acid rain. And acid rain is a great Cary Institute story because Gene Likens, our founding director, did the foundational work on acid rain and mostly at a long-term ecological research site in New Hampshire, Hubbard Brook, where he still works and where I work, and it's a good Cary Institute story. Now the problem with acid rain is when we burn fossil fuels, especially coal, it releases sulfur and nitrogen into the atmosphere. And the sulfur and nitrogen in the atmosphere turn into sulfuric acid. And the sulfuric acid then rains down on the earth, and it causes our hair to fall out. But it causes very acidic precipitation and acidic streams, and it has very negative environmental effects on plants and soils and fish and other organisms. And there's a complex spatial component to acid rain in that it was originally identified in Europe where they were burning coal in England, and that the sulfuric acid was drifting north and east into Scandinavia. And so in Scandinavia, all of a sudden there are dead lakes and dead fish. And they're like, why are our lakes dead? And they then had to put it together. And again, it's a really elegant piece of science to say, what's the link between the dead fish in this lake? You had to understand something about chemistry and something about fish and something about hydrology and something about atmospheric chemistry. And it was a very complex story that was put together. Now, Gene Likens put this together in North America, and it was quite a surprise because, again, but it's the same idea, but the idea that there were power plants in the Midwest, and the acidity was drifting from the Midwest and causing dead lakes in New Hampshire and Vermont. And so the science was very elegant. It required lots of different disciplines to come together and to produce a solution. And then the solution was, well, we're going to have to get the sulfur out of the coal. And that was implemented in the Clean Air Act amendments of 1990. There were also some really clever remediation strategies, which I'm not going to talk about extreme events. But here you had a solution was proposed, and you had, again, an integrative and articulate scientist, in this case Gene Likens, who could really advocate for that solution. And the success is the acid rain is the acidity of rainfall is much less than it used to be. And there's been tremendous recoveries in our soils and streams and trees. Let's take a look at some pictures of this. So we've been tracking this, and again, the criteria for success are: do we identify a problem? Do we propose a solution to the problem? Do we have the solution implemented? And then do we track its success? And so at Hubbard Brook, we've been tracking it, but also here at the Cary Institute, we have long-term environmental monitoring, which we started in '83. Here's the Clean Air Act amendments, and this is so, okay, for those of you in chemistry, this is hydrogen ion concentration, which is how we quantify acidity. If you have higher concentrations of hydrogen ions, that gives you more acidity. And so this is the hydrogen ion concentration over here. This is the sulfate concentration in the rainfall. And it has dropped like a rock. I mean, you pass the Clean Air Act, and it goes down and down and down until it's reached to, we have the calculations of what it ought to be. In the absence of industry. This is an amazing success. And we see it at Hubbard Brook, and we see it here at the Cary Institute. And the biological response has been tremendous. So this is red spruce. Red spruce is very susceptible to acid rain. If the soil gets acidified and if the leaves get exposed to acid rain, their ability to resist winter temperatures goes down. And so this is an example of a red spruce with winter injury. This is what the red spruce looks like at Hubbard Brook now. It's growing like crazy. We're worried about red spruce, right? So red spruce is supposed to not be doing well because it's a cold northern species, and as the climate gets warmer, we keep waiting for the red spruce to start to not do so well, but it's doing great because of the loss of acidity. So the spruce is doing better. A bunch of fish have come back, and again, acid rain, it's a very clear success story where we diagnosed a problem, proposed a solution, had the solution implemented, and then worked to track it. But there are some unanswered questions and emerging issues with acid rain, like in all these. The first was, there's quite a bit of uncertainty about how the science actually influenced the solution. So we have a picture of Gene Likens sitting in the White House with Ronald Reagan, 1983. He just confirmed this date with me. And so Likens and some other scientists went to Washington and said, we got a problem with acid rain. You really should do something about this. And the response was, we need to study this. And so the Clean Air Act, that was in '83. I mean, I think Lycan started making the first acid rain publication was in the '60s. So scientists were making a big deal about this, but the Clean Air Act amendments didn't come until 1990. And the government did study it. They invested quite a bit of money in studying acid rain. I entered graduate school in 1980. Lots of people in my generation of ecologists were trained on acid rain money. And so sometimes we wonder, should we have been more aggressive and said, no, something needs to be done now? And so there's this real question about why was there such a long lag between identification of the problem and the Clean Air Act amendments? And this becomes, we're going to come back to this when we start to talk about climate change. The other question is there a legacy of acid rain? So we would like to say, you look at this graph and you're like, mission accomplished, okay, we don't have to worry about this anymore. But acid rain is a complex effect, and so the question is there a legacy of acid rain, and how would we study that? And the hypothesis is that acidification has reduced the resilience of these ecosystems that we study, that they're now much less capable of absorbing stresses like a changing climate or changing species or other types of disturbance, and it raises questions about resilience, which is a huge challenge for our science. It's a complex topic, and so now we're grappling with the question of what is resilience? Can we quantify resilience? Can we develop early warning signals of resilience? And then ultimately, can we manage for resilience in a non-stationary world? These are questions. They're really hard questions, and the question for us is, are we going to be able to address those questions? Now, resilience is an old question, and it's one that Gene Likens and colleagues addressed in the work at Hubbard Brook, which is, again, it's an experimental forest in New Hampshire. And they started working on this in the 60s. Now, Likens was an assistant professor at Dartmouth College, and at that time in New England, there was a lot of clear cutting. And there were alert faculty members that are driving around and going, that's a problem. You know, how many times can we do this? How many times? These are northern hardwood forests. I'm going to cut them down, and the northern hardwood forest grows back. I'm going to cut them down again. And is the northern hardwood forest going to grow back? If I cut it down a third time, how much can I push these systems before I start to push them over the edge so that they change into something else? This is a very common question in all kinds of managed ecosystems. And so they did an experiment to try and push the system. In this experiment, this is one of the forested watersheds at Hubbard Brook, and they cut the trees and left them on top of the snow in 1965. And then they didn't let the forest grow back. So for 3 years, they sprayed herbicide to prevent the forest from growing back. This is a very extreme experiment. And the hypothesis was the forest is not going to grow back. It's either going to come back as some other kind of forest or as a shrubland or some state change or some change in the effect. And so this experiment was set up in the 60s, and we're still following this experiment at Hubbard Brook. And if you go out there, and you can go to this watershed, and if you go and look at this watershed, it doesn't look any different than any other 60-year-old watershed in New Hampshire. We've been tracking, these are old data, but we've been tracking the mix of species in the different layers of the forest. We've been tracking the above-ground net primary production, which is how is the forest growing. And that forest that was exposed to that very extreme treatment looks pretty good. Really doesn't look any different than any other forest in New Hampshire. This is an amazing example of resilience, and a surprising example of resilience. It's not like these are deep, rich soils. I mean, these are kind of crappy soils on a steep slope. They're shallow, they're acidic, but yet the forest showed remarkable resilience. Now, we hypothesize, though, that resilience maybe is gone, and that if we did the same experiment today, we wouldn't get the same response. And the idea is, well, this forest is 60 years later, but it's had 50 years of acid rain and base cation depletion, which I'll define in a minute, and lots of other changes. And we would argue, or we hypothesize, that the resilience is decreased. And in particular, we focus on calcium. So again, let's get our chemistry out. Acid rain is hydrogen ions, they're cations. And when you flood the soil with cations, it flushes out other cations like calcium and magnesium. Calcium and magnesium are very important nutrients in the system, and if you flush them out, then it reduces the resilience of the system. So if I push the system, if I cut it down and it needs to grow back, it needs calcium and magnesium. And what you can see is over time, due to acid rain, the amount of calcium in the soil has declined precipitously. The amount of calcium in the plants has declined precipitously, and we now hypothesize that if we did that experiment today, we wouldn't get the same result. Now, is anyone going to let us do that experiment again? Here, you all are my grant proposal panel, right? Everyone's going, no, I don't think so. It's a very intensive experiment, and I don't even want to do the experiment again because I think it's just too disruptive. And so now our question is, how can we study resilience without doing these very disruptive experiments? So what we've been searching for early warning signals of resilience. Again, this is a huge challenge to our science. And so this is work that I have to acknowledge Alex Contasta. She's a professor at the University of New Hampshire. He worked with a large group of authors, including Gene Likens. And again, here's our watersheds at Hubbard Brook. This is the watershed that was treated in '65. This picture is taken, I think, in about 1985, so it's about 20 years old. And the whole idea of early warning signals comes from economics. So if you pay attention to the economic news, we're always looking for leading indicators or lagging indicators of changes in the ecology, in the economy. In particular, we're looking for leading indicators or early warning signals of regime shifts. Now, you've probably heard this expression, but economists will tell you that using these leading indicators, they have successfully predicted 10 of the last 3 recessions. All right, now think about that. So at first you might say, well, that's a lot of false alarms, and that's not that useful. But I would argue that's what we're supposed to be doing. As scientists, we're supposed to be casting our eye out there and saying, you ought to worry about this. This might be a problem. And some of the things turn out to be problems. Some of them don't turn out to be problems. But as scientists, we are supposed to be looking for early warning signals of change. I would argue. Economists would argue, and other ecologists would argue that as well. So we wanted to take these leading indicators and apply it to data. We can do that at Hubbard Brook because we have long-term data. We have longer-term data than anyone. And the key to the early warning signals is changes in variability. So we're measuring things at Hubbard Brook. We've been measuring for 60 years. It goes along like this. And all of a sudden, the variance changes. It starts to go like this. Same thing happens in the economy. They're measuring some economic variable, the flux of dollars in something, and then all of a sudden it starts to wobble. And the idea is that a change in variability is telling you, you better pay attention. This is an early warning signal of some change in the system. Now, I'm going to spare you the details of this, but there's the basic idea. We have lots of data from lots of different kinds of systems at Hubbard Brook. And do we see evidence of wobble or squeal in the long-term data? We looked at 20 variables from the long-term data sets at Hubbard Brook, and more than half of them showed evidence showed clear early warning signals, and this was like in things like birds and insects, as well as the calcium chemistry, some of the microbial populations. Wide range of variables are showing symptoms that maybe the resilience has declined. And this is an ongoing story, right? So we have a challenge of resilience, which is just fundamental across all these ecosystems that are changing around us. And can we grapple with that challenge? And I think we're doing the science. Now the question is, can we propose solutions to really use these tools to identify places that are vulnerable to change? Can we then learn how to manage these systems to improve their resilience? And so this is kind of an ongoing question. I would argue that the science we've been doing and the way our science has evolved leaves us poised to address this emerging challenge of resilience. Okay, so I've talked about acid rain, I've talked about DDT and bald eagles. I now would like to talk about eutrophication, which is a nutrient problem. Humans use a lot of nutrients. We need nutrients to grow food. So we make fertilizer, and we use a lot of fertilizer, and we don't use it very efficiently. So we use a lot of fertilizer, and we end up with leaky fertilizer. It pollutes the water and pollutes the air. In particular, the fertilizer moves into water. The rest of the fertilizer turns into food, which we then convert into sewage, and the sewage then gets dumped into the water. And so there's tremendous amounts of nutrients moving to water, nutrient pollution. There's also industrial chemicals moving into water, industrial sources of nutrients. So if you dump all these nutrients into lakes, streams, rivers, and estuaries, the algae grow. And the algae grow, and you get this kind of green, yucky water body. And then eventually the algae die. And when the algae die and decompose, all the oxygen is sucked out of the water by the bacteria doing the decomposition. So eutrophication is this process that leaves you with green, yucky lakes, and then eventually into dead zones where all the oxygen is taken out of the water. So the fish die and the clams and stuff on the bottom die, and you get these dead zones. Now, so this has been a very widespread problem, and there's been a tremendous amount of good science that's been done to determine, well, what causes this problem? Like, what nutrients cause problems in certain places at certain times. And there's this idea that phosphorus causes eutrophication in fresh water, nitrogen much more so in salt water. And we've learned a lot about how nutrients move, this connectivity between land and the water, and how do nutrients move from crop fields into streams, into rivers, into lakes, and then into estuaries. A lot of science was done. A solution was proposed, the Clean Water Act of 1972. There was also efforts to remove phosphorus from detergents. Who remembers removing phosphorus from detergents, right? So, you know, at the end of the world, we're all going to have dirty shirts, but we don't. Nevertheless, I don't know, it's dark. I don't know, maybe our shirt is dirty. But, and so we had the solution of the Clean Water Act, and then a lot of work to protect wetlands and to protect streams to manage the sources and sinks of pollutants in the landscape. The water's cleaner. The water's cleaner all over the place. The Wappinger Creek used to have big chunks of sewage floating in it. The Hudson River had a lot of sewage in it. So our little streams, our big rivers, New York Harbor has an incredible flowering of biodiversity now in New York Harbor. The water is clean pretty much everywhere. And so the nutrient work has been a great success. Let's see some pictures of this, right? So this is the Wappinger Creek. No, it's not. But this is what a eutrophic water body looks like, and it gets real green like that. Here is an illustration of some of the science. So these are experimental lakes in Wisconsin. This is Peter and Paul Lake. A lot of work was done here by Mike Pace and John Cole of recent blessed memory, just recently passed away. And they did work in these lakes. So these lakes are identical. They dump nitrogen in one of the lakes, nothing happens. You dump phosphorus in the other lake and it turns green. And you're like, maybe phosphorus is the problem. Now, it seems pretty simple in this picture, but there was a tremendous amount of research to learn about how these nutrients cause changes in the lakes, in the algae, and the fish, and the dead zone. So there's a tremendous amount of work on nutrient limitation, very done. The other thing was that they really learned a lot about how different parts of the environment are connected. I'm not an aquatic ecologist, but I just love the river continuum concept. And it's basically the idea that you start a headwater stream, it's a little stream with big trees around it, and that stream is fed by the trees. So like all the organisms in the stream are being fed by leaves from the trees. And as the stream gets bigger, you get more open water, and so the leaves are less important, and the algal production in the stream becomes more important. And this occurs wherever streams always start out small and get big. And understanding the connectivity and the predictable changes in the environment gave them a very strong platform for saying, well, here's where we think nutrients are going to be a problem, and here's where you have to manage connectivity. And this was just really impressive science, yes, at the scale of the lake, but then also at the scale of the landscape. The other bit of connectivity focused on small streams, ephemeral streams, and small wetlands that appear to be disconnected, but the Clean Water Act says that we need to consider the fact that these ephemeral streams, which only run at certain times of the year, are extremely important for affecting the bigger streams, and they flow downstream, and they affect the large rivers and the estuaries. And so, these wetlands turned out to be extremely important. They're affected by ephemeral streams, and again, there was a lot of work on connectivity that was extremely important for dealing with the eutrophication problem. So eutrophication has been quite a success, but there are still some emerging problems and challenges with eutrophication, and I'll talk about those as well. So everyone is using nutrients, and so nutrient pollution is hard to control, and there are still lots of eutrophic water bodies. But even more important, there's been some really compelling emerging issues. So I'll talk briefly about the re-eutrophication of Lake Erie. So when I was a kid, Lake Erie was dead. It came back to life. It's dead again. And this is a huge challenge for us. There's emergence of new contaminants. We'll talk about that a little bit. And then here's the real challenge, and I'm going to come back to this several times, is pushback or resistance to environmental problems. And we'll talk about that with nutrients and wetlands. I'm going to argue, so these are really compelling problems, but I'm going to argue that our science is evolving to meet these problems. And I'm going to talk about a couple of things. I'm going to talk about new work on the emerging contaminants, which is just a great example of identifying a problem and doing something about it. I'm also going to talk about changes in the way we do science. And I'm going to talk a little bit about new monitoring networks, and I'm also going to talk about the expansion of research from ecological research to what we call social ecological research. And I'm going to argue that these changes and evolutions are helping us to address these compelling problems. Okay, so I have the Dukeses here. They know this, Lake Erie. So this is Lake Erie in the 70s. with just a compelling mix of sewage and industrial chemicals. And again, when I was a kid, Lake Erie was dead. It was a compelling driver in the environmental movement. And you can look, this is the biomass of algae, the eutrophications. In 1970, there was a lot of algae in the lake. This is the West Basin of the lake and the Central Basin of the lake. But then they passed the Clean Water Act in 72, and the water got much cleaner. And the rebirth of Lake Erie was a great success when I was in high school. So there was a great success. But this is what the lake looks like today. Right, this is an aerial image of Lake Erie, and it's got harmful algal blooms. It's got a lot of phytoplankton biomass, and it's nasty phytoplankton biomass. You can see that the biomass of algae in Lake Erie is higher than it's ever been. Einstein liked to say, when he was discussing weighty scientific issues, he would say, "What the hell?" It sounds better in German. But the question is this was a kind of bit of a shock and a challenge to people. And so now we've done a lot of science, and they've actually done a really good job of figuring out why we're having these blooms that we didn't expect. We thought the problem was solved, and now we have another problem. They've proposed solutions. Stay tuned, and we'll see, is this going to go back down again? And again, the key is, we've identified the problem, we've proposed a solution. Are we going to work hard enough to get it implemented and track the solution? And so Lake Erie is a stay tuned to Lake Erie. Another great challenge is emerging contaminants. In particular, we focus on PPCPs, which are pharmaceutical personal care products. And this was work that was really pioneered by Emma Rosie here at the Cary Institute. And the idea was, we take medicine. And the medicine ends up in the sewage treatment plant, and the sewage gets dumped into the lakes and rivers and streams, and we realize that there's a lot of drugs in our streams. And so tremendous loads of antidepressants, painkillers, and antibiotics in the streams. And who anticipated this? And so it's a classic example of scientists saying, this is a problem, we ought to do something about that. And they've quantified the doses of these chemicals and started to really work at what effect is this having on our streams. And this is another example that I'm impressed with in science, because they identified a problem that we didn't even really know about. This is really an emerging problem because we don't have the solution yet. The solution is people are not going to stop taking these medicines. The sewage treatment plants are not particularly engineered to treat them, so this is one where you should stay tuned. We've identified a problem. Are we going to propose a solution? Is that solution going to be implemented? And are we going to be able to keep track of it? But it's an interesting one. And the other thing with the nutrient problems, which are so widespread, is we've done some changes in the way we do science. And much of our science now is done in networks. So we have different kinds of scientific networks. We have some that are expensive top-down networks. So we here work with the Long-Term Ecological Research Network. We work with the National Ecological Observatory Network. These are networks making state-of-the-art measurements with very expensive instruments and really making progress on determining how the Earth is changing and what do we need to do to manage those changes. But even more impressive to me has been the emergence of these bottom-up networks that are much less expensive and decentralized. And this is my favorite, is the Global Lakes Ecological Observatory Network, GLEON, which was founded and led by Kathy Weathers here at the Cary Institute. You've got thousands of people all over the world working in lakes. And their lakes are doing funny things, just like Lake Erie. And so well, maybe we should get together. We should make some measurements of the same type. We should compare our notes. And maybe we're going to solve some really big problems with networks, but from the bottom up. And so this change to network science, both from the top down and the bottom up, I think has been a very, very important evolution of our science that is allowing us to deal with these difficult problems. The other thing with these bottom up networks is they're out in the community. And when we're out in the community, we get to understand how do people perceive these problems and how do our proposed solutions interact with those people. And this becomes the real challenge for us when I'm going to talk about resistance, because if we propose solutions that are a real pain in the neck for people, they're not going to do them. So my favorite example is the nitrogen wars. I told you I would talk about nitrogen. There are nitrogen wars in the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a very progressive country with very great interest in improving environmental quality. They also have very productive agriculture, and they use a lot of nitrogen. They have a lot of nitrogen pollution. And so the government has been pushing the farmers to improve the nitrogen performance of their agriculture, and finally the farmer says, we've had enough. And there's this farmer revolt, and it has turned the nation upside down. This is what we should be worried about, right? If we propose solutions, right? So we're trying to diagnose problems and propose solutions and have those solutions implemented. And if people say, boo, I'm not doing that, then what's going to happen to us? And so this is, and I think, again, unless we do research that accounts for people's perceptions and values and the effects of these things on people, we're going to flunk, we're going to fail. We've also had tremendous resistance to wetlands laws. So we've learned how to manage the landscape to protect wetlands and to protect ephemeral streams. That's really important for reducing the eutrophication problems in the rivers and the lakes and the estuaries. But if it drives the farmers crazy, they're not going to do it. And so there's this need for this kind of new, what we call social ecological research to make sure that the solutions that we propose are going to work. Otherwise, we're going to backslide. Okay, so I have made the case we've been successful. I've give some examples. I would now like to talk about why do I think we've been successful and what are some of the challenges that we face. So for success, I would argue there's two reasons that we've been successful. One is we've been relentlessly multidisciplinary, and the other is we have had some success with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now the thing with multidisciplinarity is all these problems I've talked to you about can't be solved by one person alone. So we think of our old-fashioned models of scientists. Guy with thick glasses and a lab coat working all alone at night in the laboratory with the Bunsen flames going, and that's not how Gene Lycan solved the acid rain problem. Gene Lycan's a smart guy, but he didn't want to think, I can solve this problem on my own. I'm going to have to talk to a hydrologist and an atmospheric chemist, and I'm going to have to talk to a whole bunch of other scientists. And the problems that we grapple with are humbling and sobering, but it's had an effect, I would argue, this is a hypothesis, on the culture of our science, and it's made us more open, and it's made us more collaborative. The need to be collaborative also, I think, allows us to keep focused on the big picture. So I work in a team, and on that team, I'm the nitrogen guy on the team, and I'm very tempted to just really get obsessed with nitrogen and think about nitrogen in the morning and nitrogen all day and nitrogen into the night. But the rest of the people on the team are like, Groffman, where's the big picture? And so when you're forced to work in a multidisciplinary team, I think it's helped us to keep a focus on the big picture. And so multidisciplinarity has been a driver of our success and a hallmark of our success. The other, I think we've had some success that the need for multidisciplinarity has driven an effort to diversity, equity, and inclusion, where we've realized these are hard problems and we need everybody on board. We can't work with just half the population or 40% of the population. We need lots of ideas and lots of input. And I think the need for multidisciplinarity, the need for a culture that's open has allowed us to have some success. Now in ecology, we've had some success with gender diversity. And for a long time, 50% of the PhDs in ecology have gone to women. There's still tremendous problems with gender diversity in ecology in that we lose women as they move up through the academic pipeline. But nevertheless, we had some success, and especially compared to some other disciplines which are not awarding 50% of the PhDs to women. So we've had some success, and again, I think it's contributed quite a bit to the success, the building of our multidisciplinary teams and the success of our science. We have flunked in increasing racial and ethnic diversity. And this is a challenge in science across all branches of science, but it's not just ecology, all branches of science. Despite, Alan Berkowitz is here, he's been working on this in ecology for some number of decades, and it's hard. But I would argue that we are poised to improve ethnic and racial diversity in ecology because we do a different kind of research now. So we're doing much more of this participatory, community-based research where we're working with communities and humans to find out what they perceive and what they value. And we're doing lots of work in urban areas. And so I would argue that we're establishing a platform for improving diversity, equity, and inclusion in ecology. Urban ecology, I think, is really going to help us. So urban ecology is a topic that's been very active here at the Cary Institute, led for many, many years by Stuart Pickett. And this is a classic example of the kind of transformative research in urban ecology I think is going to help us with diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in cities, back, I guess about in the 30s or about several decades ago, the government and financial institutions drew red lines around neighborhoods where black people were living, and they said, we're not going to invest in those neighborhoods. Now, 50 years later, that lack of investment shows up in there's not any trees in these neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods are really hot, There's lots of concern in cities about urban heat island, where the neighborhoods get really hot, and the urban heat island is much worse in these historically black neighborhoods. And so this has been a very hot topic in urban ecology, and I would say about urban ecology has just exploded at the Ecological Society of America. So Pickett's been working on this since the late 80s. And in the 80s and 90s, there would be a session on urban ecology at the ecology meetings, of the Ecology Society of America meetings. Now, there's sessions every day, maybe 2 a day, and it's really a hot topic. And so now we're saying, okay, we're identifying a problem of urban heat island and the lack of trees, and we're proposing solutions to those problems. And the solutions to those problems are engaging communities that are not well represented in our discipline. And so I would argue that a new kind of research in a new kind of place gives us some hope that we can attract people that have not been involved in our science. We can attract them into our science. Okay. So I think we've been successful because of multidisciplinarity and because of diversity, equity, inclusion. What are the challenges? I want to talk about 2 things. I want to talk about climate change, and I want to talk about resistance and pushback. Now, we got to talk about climate change. I give this talk, and people are like, Groffman, what are you talking about? The world is on fire. Right? Climate change can really get you, you get really concerned, and people get depressed about climate change. But I ask, have we done the science to identify the problem? Have we proposed solutions? Have we worked to have those solutions implemented? Is society beginning to implement those solutions? And from a scientific point of view, have we changed our science to address these new challenges? So let's ask these questions, and then we'll talk about resistance. So, have we done the science? Have we gone through that chain where we identify the problem, propose a solution, work to have it implemented? I draw your attention to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Program on Climate Change, which has been working since the 70s. My God, it was black and white. Right? They were working in the 70s to identify the question of climate change, in a series of reports going through the 80s and the 90s, which have been saying, is the climate changing? Why is the climate changing? What are the effects of climate change? What should we do about it? And they've been working together in a group and sending a clear, consistent, coherent message about here's what the problem is and here's what you need to do about it. And they have been talking since the 90s that we need to change the way we use energy, no carbon energy, and improve carbon sinks and lifestyle and behavior changes. Again, a clear, consistent, coherent message about what needs to be done. And again, I think we learned maybe we weren't aggressive enough with acid rain in the 80s. Maybe we should have. No one is saying, and the IPCC is saying, we need to study this some more. I think you could have bought off the scientific, they could have tried to buy off the scientific community with billions of research dollars, but it wouldn't have worked this time. And this time people were saying, you don't need to study this, you need to take action now. And so I would argue that we have really done the science, and we have proposed the solution, worked hard to implement the solutions. We've done it at the international level with the IPCC. We also do it at the national level. So many of us have participated in the national climate assessments in the United States, which make data available on a county-by-county basis. So you go to these reports, and you can see, in my particular county, when is spring coming now, and what happened to the winter, and how hot is it, and how much does it rain? And so we've worked hard at the international scale, but then also at the national scale. And then perhaps even more impressive is work at the highly localized scale. So in our 2009 conference, where we had people and communications efforts from all over the world, they made the case that highly local academic organizations can play an important role in bringing together to talk about complex scientific issues and really help people to grapple with this. We're very proud of the Thursday night or Friday night. Is it always Thursday night now? Yeah. Whatever. But this group, people coming together to talk about complex science issues, is something we're quite proud of at the Cary Institute. We also have long-term monitoring data. So we can come together and we can talk about, okay, here's the annual temperatures that have been increasing since the 80s. Okay, the temperature's warmer. But if we're in a highly localized session, we can talk about more nuanced effects of climate change. So we can see, here's the spring. And the spring, you saw this last week when it was snowing and a cold, bitter wind. Spring is not coming any earlier. But fall is coming much later. And as a result, the growing season is getting longer. Right? This is a much more kind of a subtle effect of climate change. And my friend Laura is here. She's been trying to grow bananas for a long time. I'm looking forward to growing bananas as the growing season gets longer and longer and longer. But again, localized data gives us an opportunity to grapple with climate change. And so I think it's an important component of success. So now, we've identified the problem. We've proposed a solution. We've worked hard to have the solution implemented. are the solutions being implemented? This is a recent article from the New York Times talking about the use of solar energy from 1990, and it's exploding. This is the US, this is China. This is wind energy, right? 2000, exponential increase. Now, I'm used in ecology to looking at exponential increase, but they're always bad. You know, it's always the increase of pollution or the increase of population or the loss of species. But here, we're starting to see some symptoms of real efforts to decarbonize the economy. And again, I am maybe over-optimistic, but I think in 2050, we're going to look back and we're going to say, you know, in about 2012, 2015, they really started to take this seriously, and they really started to change the economy. And again, these rates of increase in solar and wind are much greater than anyone predicted 3 to 5 years ago. So there is symptoms that perhaps we're starting to turn the corner. The use of solar and wind has gone up, and the price has gone down. And again, we look at lots of graphs like this in ecology where things are going down at a very sharp rate, but they're usually bad. But now the price of solar and wind has gone. So I'd argue there's a little bit of hope that that's coming. And again, the local examples help. Right? So we have a solar field here at the Cary Institute, and we track our solar use. So here's the year to date, right? So this is through April 5th, and this is how much energy we've used, this is how much we've produced. It's the winter, for goodness sake. I mean, it's the winter, and we have used more energy than we've produced, but not much. And so it gives you kind of hope that and this building uses a lot of energy. We have laboratories, we use a lot of energy, but yet we're pretty close to producing all the energy that we use. So I'm a little bit hopeful about climate change. The thing that I really think we need to worry about is the yellow vests and the resistance. So the yellow vest protests, I don't know if you follow this, but this was in France. And France has been very progressive and aggressive at combating climate change, and they implemented a new green energy tax. And in Paris, it didn't really particularly bother people. They don't have cars, they don't drive. But in the rural areas where people have to spend a lot of money on energy, they went crazy. And so they started having demonstrations, and they took the demonstrations to Paris. And the demonstrations turned into riots, and the whole country was turned upside down. And again, this is the question of, and think about this urban-rural differences and differences between rural people who make a living one way versus urban people who make a living another way. This is common in many countries across the world. And it raises the point that if we don't pay attention to how do our solutions affect people, we're going to get resistance and pushback, and we're going to flunk, and we're going to fail. And so this, to me, I think is the challenge that we have to address. Okay, so I think I'm quite proud to be the incoming president of the Ecological Society of America, because I think we've been really successful as a discipline by a very expansive definition, which I'm prepared to defend, that it's not just doing the science to diagnose problems and propose solutions. But I think if we really want to be an effective discipline, we're going to have to work hard to have those solutions implemented by society, and we're going to have to track the success. We've been successful because we focus on multidisciplinary. I think because we've had some success with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think our success poises us to deal with the challenges. There's always new challenges coming, but I think that if we continue to do the things we've done, we'll meet those challenges, and we'll end up with a science that is good science and useful to society. And I thank you for your attention.
I will say, having seen the preview of Peter's talk, I didn't think he could get through it all in 45 minutes. So,
I also have to say, this is my normal teaching slot at Brooklyn College.
Yeah.
It's 6:30 to 9:15. So that's just the first part.
So we have over 200 people in the virtual audience, but let's take a question from the in real life audience first, and then I'll ask a question that came in over the web.
You mentioned, going way back in your talk, acid rain. You mentioned the greens and the whites. What about the Adirondacks?
So the question was, acid rain. I mentioned acid rain in the Green Mountains and the White Mountains. What about the Adirondacks? So the Adirondacks had terrible problems with acid rain. There are a lot of lakes, beautiful lakes in the Adirondacks, and there was tremendous acidity problems. They're much better now. And there's been, again, very good science in the Adirondacks. The other thing that gets you in the Adirondacks is mercury, coming in from the atmosphere, along also a byproduct of burning coal. And why is there a sign on a lake, pristine lake in the Adirondacks that don't eat the fish? It's loaded with mercury. That also has gone away because we stopped burning coal. So the Adirondacks...
If you could catch a fish.
It was what?
If you
Well, then you got to, because this is a good point, because if you catch the fish, then you got to clean it, then you got to cook it, you got to eat it, so maybe it's better off.
So, Peter, I'm going to ask a question from the virtual audience. Can you comment on the non-linearity of change, right? So, for example, a decline in conditions doesn't appear as a steady trend, but rather jumps to a plateau that changes the entire ecosystem response.
Yeah, so sudden changes are one of the great challenges in science altogether, and which is why we are searching for these early warning signals of sudden change. Just like the economists would really like to be able to predict when there's going to be a financial crisis or there's some type of crash. And so we're trying to do the same thing in systems. And again, the idea is looking for the squeal, looking for the wobble. So if I'm measuring, and we have these new networks where we can monitor things really quite well, so as we're monitoring along and we start to see a wobble, we then say, oh, that's where we should be paying attention. And of course, the challenge of the science is once we see the wobble, what do? Right? So in economics, we see a warning signal come, we take our money and we put it in the freezer. Some of us put it in the freezer, others put it in the mattress. But what's the same response for ecosystems? That's why we're really excited about the early warning system stuff. It's a big challenge for us. Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like we should be encouraged by what you're saying, and we are. But tell me whether our experience with fruit trees lines up with what you're saying. My experience with fruit trees may or may not fit into this, but it would appear that last year the buds came out early, the flowers came out early, and then one frost in the east kills the whole crop. So does this mean that in the future the peach trees and other fruit trees might be destroyed? All you need is one single frost and there's a wipeout. Or if we're going to be Georgia in 100 years, well, we grow peaches in Dutchess County in 100 years if we're Georgia. But I'm not going to be around for the next 100 years.
Yeah.
So where does that leave us?
I love this question. So the question is about fruit trees. And fruit trees really make you nervous because they flower, it gets warm in March and they flower, and then there's a frost and they get killed. So fruit trees are dumb. Right, so I don't know how to say this, but in the plant community, right, fruit trees, like look at the maples on look at the maples on my block, right? And so you have a warm spell, and the peach trees in particular, it's spring, but the maple trees don't, right? So you can have a lot of really warm weather. The maples going, I don't think so, and so. The reason that is we have bred fruit trees to do three things: produce fruit, and produce fruit. And so maybe we need to start to rethink about how we breed fruit trees to breed for climate resilience. And so I think we can get smarter fruit trees. I think there's a chance for dealing with that. But the basic question you're asking though is the climate has become unpredictable. We call it non-stationarity, right? And so it rains differently than it used to. We get the changes in temperature differently than we used to, and the world is wacky, and so we need to, but we can see it, and then we just need to try to adapt to it. Some of it we can adapt to, some of it is harder. The fruit trees, I think we can deal with.
We can get the fruit trees to blossom later. Is that the solution?
You got to think like a maple tree, right? Or oaks are even worse. You cannot get the oak trees to leaf out early, no matter how warm it gets, because they have some way of sensing their environment, and they're a little more cautious. And I think the fruit trees are less cautious, and so we need to breed in a little, just say no.
So one more from the web, and then we'll do a couple from the audience. Here's something from John Mickelson. Frank Eigler famously suggested nature is not more complex than we think, it is more complex than we can think. And so from your perspective, where on the spectrum would you posit that humankind and science currently reside?
So
So basically, are we able to think about the problems, or are the problems so complex we can't get our heads around them?
So I think that we're doing pretty well. And one of the things we like to say, and it's been in a couple of these Cary conference books, is ecological science is like a table with four legs. Let's see if I can remember the four legs. But one of them is theory. One of them is theory, long-term observations, experiments, and comparative studies. And the whole idea of long-term studies came from the realization in the 60s that ecosystems, which are studying, are complex ecosystems. They're complex entities, they change in complex ways, difficult to predict, and so therefore we need long-term studies, and we need complex experiments like the one that I showed you okay, we're not going to do that experiment again, but it was a very ambitious experiment to really address hard problems. And at the same time, we have theory. We were talking at lunch about Bob May, famous professor at Princeton, was a theorist. And so I think, and all kinds of science is always dealing with unimaginable complexity. Makes it fun to be a scientist, why you get up in the morning. Two more.
I was just wondering, do you think it's ethical for Cary to bait and kill deer?
So the question is it ethical for Cary to bait and kill deer? And I don't know exactly, I don't know if we bait deer. But I do think we have had a deer hunt at Cary for a long time, and with the objective of controlling the deer population, because the high deer population has an effect on regrowth of the system. And hunting deer is very complex. Personally, I think that our deer program is important and effective, and it's a good thing. Many people don't. It's very controversial, and I think we have to respect people who there are many people who really think we shouldn't hunt deer. We should look for other ways to control them. So it's a complex issue. Personally, I think that our deer program here has been very carefully managed. They've collected a tremendous amount of data on the deer itself and on the effects that deer have, and we've learned a lot from it. And so I personally think it's okay, but I also recognize that many people think it don't, and that's why we have discussions about it. One more.
Oh, thanks. Science seems to be highly reluctant to deal with the issue of recycling. And we know what the problem is, and it's highly political. Our recycling centers are run by thugs and crooks. And science doesn't seem to be able to move in on this territory.
Yeah, so recycling. Well, we could really talk about recycling because it really kind of gets you frustrated because you know that we should be doing it and we're not. It has not been a great success. And so to me, the only way out of it is we got to continue to make a fuss about the fact that we need more recycling. Of course, the other thing with recycling is, we should reduce the source a lot, right? So now we have this huge problem with microplastics, right? So we like to spend what do we do? Like we're pretty good in environmental science at looking at things that we did 30 years ago that were pretty dumb. And we're like, oh yeah, that was pretty dumb, but we're much smarter now, right? I like to think now, like what are we doing now that in 30 years we're going to say, what were they thinking? Microplastics. You heard it here, and it's starting to. So I think yes, recycling. People are still working hard to improve recycling. Like New York City is working very hard at it. I also think we need to focus on source reduction quite a bit. And so in New Jersey, they banned bags at the store, right? So if you go into the Acme supermarket in New Jersey, they don't have any bags. And I think we need to get a little more aggressive on the source side as well as improving the recycling. But And again, the pushback thing, right? If we, and is that New Jersey law good? Or is it making people really cranky about recycling? I don't know. Recycling is a really good one to talk about because it's an immediate issue that affects us every day. It's a good one.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. It's a joy to be in, I like to say 4 dimensions, not 3, because we're here for time as well. And so please make sure you tell your friends to come. We will be continuing this series and we will be sending out notices. We had over 200 people in the virtual audience, about 100 here. And I'd like to say that if you're looking for positive things about a pandemic, as we look for positive things about it in ecology, it has allowed organizations like ours to have a much broader reach. Those 200 people were all over the world, and many of them could not possibly have been here tonight otherwise. So thank you for being here in person, and thank you for being here virtually. And Peter, thank you for a wonderful talk.